Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to paint a red fox in acrylics. Now as always, the first thing I like to start off with once I've got the background in is the eye. Now I am actually going to create a separate tutorial showing how I created this background because that really does focus a lot on blending techniques, so I'm going to feature that in an upcoming video. Now when I work with the eyes, I like to make sure that I've got the shape and size of the eye right before I focus on any kind of layering and detail. Now once I've got that established, this is when I can start to work on the iris. Now as you can see here, I'm gradually building up my lighter values, but always focusing on good contrast. Now the wonderful thing about working with acrylics is we have that luxury of being able to layer our lightest values over even the darkest layers. Now by having bright highlights and dark shadows, this is what creates that three-dimensional look of a painting. It's not worrying about the exact colour as such, it is something where I want to influence the colour through the use of glazes, and this is something that I'm going to really focus on throughout this video. But it's the lights and the darks that are going to give it that extra level of realism. Now I've got a wide variety of different subjects featured in acrylic tutorials here on YouTube, and I always focus on building up a good base foundation first. It doesn't matter the fur texture, the animal that I'm painting, I always want to be making sure that I've hinted at that base foundation as accurately as I can. Now here, this first stage, it does look messy, but that's okay. I'm not going to jump into adding my details on this layer. I want to be making sure that I've captured a smoothness, the blending of the lights and the darks, so that I've got that soft layer first. Now if I have to work with 2 or 3 layers initially to build up to this stage, then that's something that I'm going to really focus on. Now this will also depend on the background colour, so if you've used more water in that base foundation, you are going to have more of your background colour show through that transparent layer. If that's happening, then you do want to work with a little bit more of either an opaque paint, a thicker paint, or even just more paint on your brush, and you want to then build up those layers until you can't see that background colour through. Now as I start to build in the initial fur texture, here I'm only focusing on my mid-stage layers. I'm not trying to paint in those finer details that are sitting on the very top. We do want to leave those for those last layers. Now as I'm building up here, you can see that I'm focusing on my values. The colour looks terrible. It's not as it looks in the finished painting in the corner. But as I start to adjust my colour here through the use of glazes, you can see that I'm really starting to then capture that lovely glow and the orange colours within the fur. Now I do have a video here on YouTube, it's all about glazes. I'm showing various examples of how to use them, how they can add depth, and tips on how to make them as effective as possible. If that video is of interest, I'll link that in the description below. Now even here at this stage, it's like I'm painting over some of that texture, and that's absolutely fine. Because I'm always looking to build up the fur texture from what's closest to the skin and working up to those finer details, at times here we do need to paint over existing layers, but it's about allowing those layers to still show through. You can see lots of those darker base layers that I initially painted in, and still that first layer of texture. As I'm building up here, it's all of this layering process that's gradual and subtle that helps to reinforce more of that realism. And again, when I've achieved more of my lighter variations within that fur, I can wait for that layer to dry and then adjust the colour with a glaze. Now the reason I like to work with glazes like this is because it means that when I'm adding my details, like I am here, I don't have to also worry about mixing the exact colour of that fur for that layer that I can see in my reference photo. Now if I can break up these 2 main processes, then it makes it far easier to tackle. I don't have to worry about trying to get it all accurate at that one layer. Now when painting high levels of realism, there are many different considerations through each process. So the layering, the contrast, how we move the brush, how much paint we should be using, how much water we should be adding to that mixture. When do we blend? When do we let that layer dry? All of these things make a big difference to the overall finished painting. Now because of that, I like to record my real-time tutorials with a voiceover while I'm painting, so everything is explained in the moment. It makes the lesson step by step. Even something that might appear more challenging is easier to tackle because I'm helping to guide you through that each step. So if this or any of my other real-time tutorials are of interest, then I'll link all of the information to those in the description below. Now when I came to working on the nose muzzle area, this was where the brush technique needed to be adjusted quite considerably. So the fur elsewhere on the face was much longer, and here I needed to make sure that I adjusted my brush strokes to show the different length and fur texture. Now, as always, I'm still starting with a good base foundation. It looks quite dark, but that means that I can then layer all of my subtle details on top. Now, if you're using a lighter mixture of paint and it's not really showing up but you feel like it should, that's an indication that your base layer isn't dark enough. Once you go back in and make that change, and it can be as simple as adding a darker glaze that takes a matter of seconds, that lighter layer of paint will show up far better, and you'll also enhance the depth. The reason being is because you've adjusted your contrast. You can see here that I've come back in and darkened areas because as I started to add those mid-tone highlights, I just feel like I wasn't achieving the right level of contrast that I needed. And because of the beautiful lighting in the reference photo, this side of the face was almost in shadow, so I did need to have my base layers dark enough in order to replicate that. Now, lighting in a reference photo can make or break a painting. If you've got a really interesting one-sided light source or something like this where it's almost got a slight backlighting, this can create a really dramatic painting, and the contrast here becomes really important. Now, it's at this stage of the painting where I was very happy with how it looked, but I did feel like I needed to just adjust a couple of the darker areas. So again, I just added a glaze, not all over this time, but just where I noticed some of those shadows in the reference photo. And now I can come back in with my rigger brush or my liner brush and start hinting at more of those delicate details. Now, as I start to work with this brush, this is where the amount of paint on the brush and how thin or thick the mixture should be is really important. If you have a mixture that's too thick, you're not going to be able to create the same number of brush strokes. You'll end up creating a couple and you'll feel like the paint is getting stuck. If that happens, you want to add a little bit more water to that mixture and it should be easier to use. Now, on the other end of that scale, if you use too much water and your details are running or they're almost beading up at the ends, that's an indication that there's too much water in that mixture. So then you want to add a little bit more paint and get the balance just right. Now, there is no set rule or ratio. This is how much water you should use, this is how much paint, and it will vary on the brushes as well. So the rigger brush that I'm using here, I'm going to need a slightly thinner mixture to get this paint to work in the right way with this brush, compared to something like a filbert or a round brush. And one of the best ways of practicing with this is just to use some normal watercolour paper and your brushes. You can just use some black paint and experiment with different mixtures and different lengths of lines. So a longer line is going to require a slightly thinner mixture as well. Now again, all of the aspects of brush technique like that, how much paint to use and so on, is something that I do cover thoroughly in all of my real-time tutorials. Now onto the next section. I loved painting the ears of this fox. I thought the texture here was so different. It was much softer. This ear here is a little bit out of focus, so I needed to use more blend-in techniques. But no matter the out of focus or in focus portions, my base layer is still important. You can see here that I'm still following the fur direction. I'm focusing on my lights and my darks, but the blending of each of those layers is more noticeable now, especially as I start to work with some of those details compared to the techniques that I used on the face. Now, when you've got an area that is out of focus, but you can still see the hinting of that detail, I personally like to build up that softness in stages. So you can see that as I've now allowed that layer to dry, I can start working on the next stage because I've got that base foundation where it should be. When I start to blend the edges, I don't want to make it completely out of focus like it's miles in the distance, but I do want there to be a softness on the edges. Now I'm using a combination of wet and wet blending techniques and a little makeup brush there. You'll see that throughout times of this process. But the way that I'm blending this is not allowing that paint to dry before I have a chance to blend. Now this is something that we do have to potentially struggle with sometimes when working with acrylics, especially if we're new to the medium. But there are ways that we can make that paint stay wet for hours if needed. Using a fine mist spray bottle is a great way of allowing that paint to be more used in a similar way to oils. If you keep misting your canvas with water, that layer of paint underneath does not get a chance to dry. Now, how much water to apply, how to use those fine mist spray bottles, again, it is a little bit of practice and trial and error, but this is something that I do also cover in my real-time tutorials. Now, in order to build up the softness, I'm always trying to tell myself and remember how blended do I need it to be. When we're working on something that's out of focus, it's very easy to then overblend. But there should still be definition here in some parts of the ear. Now, just like when I worked on the face, I haven't focused on mixing the exact colour at each stage. I'm only focusing on my values. Now, the other thing that's also important when painting specific areas of any animal is what fur is overlapping another section. So, for example, there are fur details on the top of the head that are sitting in front of the ears. It's easier to then paint the ears first and add those overlapping details on top. What that will also do is add a lot more depth to the painting. It will push that ear further back when those details on the top of the head are put in front. Now, when I started adding my details here with a liner brush, I need to be really aware of what level of out of focus or softness I'm aiming for that area. So when we start working with our details, it can be more tempting to leave those details fine, which for most cases would work well. But if you do have areas of a painting that are out of focus, even some of the finer details need to also be softened. Now, of course, this is going to vary depending on the reference photo, and it is something that is going to potentially only be relevant for certain layers. But noticing that softness versus the in-focus portions is something that can add a huge amount of depth, more of that three-dimensional feel to the painting. And it's these details here where I'm adding those in front. You can really see now where the ear gets pushed back as a result of that. Now, the final part of this painting, this is where the fur did change in the structure. So the fur is actually coming towards the viewer slightly, like it's almost a bit ruffled up. So in order to create that effect, I want to be focusing on getting those darker areas, those narrower sections of shadows in place first. So you can see here that I'm paying real close attention to making sure I've got those in roughly the right place, but that they are going in the right direction. This is going to help build up the right structure and shaping of the neck. Now, as always, I'm focusing on getting a good base foundation in here, doing more of that wet on wet blending technique to create that softness, but here I'm also indicating at the fur direction. Now, the fur detail in here on this part of the painting is different to the face in that the details here were more finer, wispier. So I wanted to build up my layers of softness first, and I'm then coming back in here with my rigger brush again, and the details that I'm adding here are far more separated. So this is where the mixture of paint and how much paint is loaded on the brush is going to really help with these kinds of finer details. If too much paint is loaded on the brush, those details are going to be far thicker, and that's something that's going to influence the texture. Now, as I'm continuing to build up my layers here, yet again, I'm only focusing on my values. I'm not worrying about the colour. I can adjust all of that with the use of glazes. Now, when working with glazes, it's really important to make sure that the layers of paint underneath are dry. So to wait for those layers to dry, I'm just coming back in and adding some of those wispier details on the top of the neck that overlap the background. Now, when working on those details, it is important. They really do help to make that painting look like it's more together with that background, rather than a sticker that's just been stuck on top. If the edges of the subject, especially for a longer coated animal like this, if those edges are too harsh, that is going to make it look like it's just been cut out. So I want to be making sure that I have overlapped those details and got that natural variation. Now, the longer the fur, the more of that freedom of movement it's going to have. So you've got a couple of those different fur details that are going to be curving in various ways. They're going to be different lengths and so on. Making sure that I've captured that is really important. So I really do hope that this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you would like to paint along to this real-time tutorial, then I'll link all of the information to that in the description below. But if you do have any art-related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video at the end of the week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.